We're joined today on the 6Ps podcast by Jim Lord, who's a fellow English teacher. How are you going today, Jim?
Awesome, thanks for having me.
No worries at all.
Excited to be on this prestigious podcast.
Well, you know, if we were going to have a first guest, definitely you were number one on the list. So it is great to have you.
Really, thank you.
No worries. We're here to talk about Rear Window.
Yep.
And your thoughts on the film. I guess I'll start with a really broad question. What is Rear Window about?
I think, obviously you and I have both seen it numerous times, but there's something thematically and contextually that I notice each time. But I think from a general and, like you say, broader point of view, I think it's about Hitchcock psychoanalyzing society and understanding that that sense of anonymity, whether you're willing to admit it or not, is something that everybody enjoys. And that's why we become so, well, despite being forced, so happily complicit with the protagonist, because we kind of like the idea of being in the shadows and watching someone else's life unfold. And I think, obviously, that spirals as he gets further and further entrenched in that. But, yeah, so voyeurism, I think, obviously, thematically is our access point, but yeah, I think it's Hitchcock's clever way of psychoanalyzing society and understanding that everyone enjoys that.
Yeah, and it is that nice parallel with thinking about people watching this in a theatre.
Yep.
And the parallels there as well. With Alfred Hitchcock himself, are you a massive fan of his work?
Yeah, big. I used to run a class back at a school in Canberra called Film as Text, and he was an integral part of that unit, just because I think, as well as being a theatre teacher and someone that really enjoys the theatre, it's so important to engage with your audience and have a relationship. And I think he's the master of that, obviously colloquially as the master of suspense, but he creates that because he understands the mindset and, like I said before, the internal psychological positioning of the audience. And I think whether it's Birds or whether it's Psycho or Rear Window, he taps into the everyday and the ordinary and creates something quite suspenseful out of it. So yeah, he's brilliant. He's brilliant. I mean, you know, he's a flawed man in a lot of different ways, but from a entertainment and filmic point of view, yeah, he's brilliant.
And that's a really important part, I think, of studying this film, is having that understanding of Hitchcock and his work. And you're right, when you talk about films like Birds, Vertigo and Psycho, they're still as much relevant today, and people still talk about them as much today as they were back then. And even when I think of Rear Window, I think of the setting and how amazing that was to put it on a stage.
Incredible.
And how intricate it all was. And I know most of the listeners have probably done this, but delved into a bit of the trivia behind the film. But knowing that some of those characters could actually live in those apartments.
And also did.
She did.
The entire time, yeah.
She did. So I like that idea about voyeurism and the idea that this film is a really, for me, like that representation or that reflection of what was happening at the time. And we often talk about including context information into our essays. And for me, this idea about McCarthyism and voyeurism, it's that idea. I often get asked, does Hitchcock endorse voyeurism or doesn't he? And it's actually an open question. You can look at things either way. What are your thoughts with that?
I think his inclusion, I mean, obviously it was a bit of a sort of artistic motif of his to include himself in the film, which obviously, you know, some great directors have done since, and Tarantino and alike. But I think that for me is a really good piece of evidence that that he absolutely condones it, I guess. I mean, he becomes one himself, and I think it's a very subtle inclusion in the film, but he's winding the clock in the composer, in the songwriter's apartment. He doesn't just focus on the clock. He actually looks out the window, and I think, for me, that's a really nice acknowledgement of what you've prefaced there. I think again, I know that I've sort of mentioned a few times, but contextually, absolutely I agree, the McCarthyism and his understanding of the social context at the time, not only in regards to gender norms, but in the context that you've sort of mentioned in regards to voyeurism, that there was a mistrust amongst neighbours with Russian spies and the propaganda around that. And yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he understood that audiences would attend this film, whether it was in the back of their mind or the forefront of their thinking, that they didn't trust their neighbours. And that's why, and as I've said to my class, imagine a director walking into a film studio and pitching the idea of Rear Window. It's not groundbreaking stuff, but it works the same way that Psycho is still scary, because everybody has to have a shower at some point. Everybody likes that anonymity, but from a 1954 or 1950s context, that everybody had that element of mistrust. And I really like what you said about the set. I mean, that's coming back to, again, not only was it Hitchcock pitching this idea, so that had a lot more sway, but the idea of the set, and it's something to really talk about, because as you've said, I'm sure people have unpacked the trivia, but the idea that Jeffrey's apartment was actually the original ground level of the film studio, and he waved his wand and said what he wanted, and they knocked out the floor and built down into the basement. So although not necessarily something to include in your essay, it's absolutely imperative that you understand the power that this man had in that industry and how he wished to use it.
So let's focus on our protagonist, LB Jeff Jeffries. Do we sympathise with him at all?
It's really interesting question, because I think the disparity amongst most viewers is going to come down to a lot to do with identifying with a particular gender and how you view the film with that lens. Also, cultural and social upbringings, I think, can really affect the way, that term "shut up" in some households is
massive, isn't it?
Yeah, and sometimes it's massive.
That's it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I definitely find his demeanour confronting, but you also can see his frustration. I mean, Elisa does speak over the top of him a lot, but I think the issue with his response is that it comes from a place of entitlement, patriarchal entitlement, that he really sees like he should be allowed to speak when he wants to speak, and that there's that idea of subservience in the societal norms of the time. So in answer to your question, I don't sympathise with him, but I've read some amazing essays of students that do.
And I guess that goes to show the power of Grace Kelly and Lisa herself. And Hitchcock does this beautifully, and we talk about the costume, particularly with Lisa, how emphatic it is, and how it's been designed, and how it even contrasts with Jeffrey's in his plain clothing. And then you've got the lighting and the camera work. It all comes together to portray or depict Lisa as someone who's quite amazing, and someone who is able to balance her career with the relationship, and even her involvement then in the voyeurism, and later on actually entering the apartment, which I think that's, when I think about Rear Window, that's the scene I think of.
Amazing,
And I still don't know how she did that. Dress and heels, and managed to climb into that apartment. Yeah,
and that's the incredible, going back to the start of this podcast, when you mentioned about Hitchcock's power and success and skill, is that, absolutely, there's definite intent behind the lighting and the costume and all the production areas that become so evident in your analysis, but to scale that wall so fluently, wearing the attire, is absolutely intentional. Not only that, but then the reaction shots and the cooler shot of Jeffrey's almost feminine, stereotypically feminine reaction, the jumpy,
he's quite squeamish, isn't he? He's very squeamish.
So, and that's obviously a motif throughout, that Jeffrey's, unknowingly struggles with. And I think that's a really important thing, that there's a lack of awareness, which is probably going back to why I don't necessarily sympathise with him, because he's not aware of his flaws, and none of us really are in that context. But he's a product of the patriarchal society at the time, and that's what Hitchcock challenges with scenes like the one you mentioned.
Yeah. And we talk about marriage particularly, and this idea that he wants to keep things status quo. And I think I love that quote, because literally he just wants things to stay the same forever. He doesn't want any responsibility. He doesn't want to take things further, which I still, to this day, don't understand. If Grace Kelly was wanting to marry you, why were you willing to say yes?
Yeah.
But it does go to show too, I guess, and it is a society that is shifting. It's gone through World War II where women were working, and so there were lots of women like Lisa who were coming to grips with this idea about working and also maintaining relationship. For men, it was something they were confronted with, but for women, they still valued marriage, it seems. And I think Lisa epitomises that idea of being able to balance both things, both aspects of her life.
Yeah, and I think the difference between Lisa and Lonely Hearts, for example, is that Lonely Hearts is about, near the end of the film, is about to go to the greatest length to escape her societal pressure, because her idea of marriage is so that she can become a member of society. She has nothing, no assets, potentially, without creating a false backstory for her, but, society at the time deemed women to not be members of society as single women. But Lisa is different. She's a product of the empowered female, like you said, that was forced to work because, long story short, everyone else was dead, and they needed the women to work during that time. And like you said, popping out 5 years after post-World War II, they didn't want to go back. They had money, they had status, they had control of their own lives, and that's absolutely epitomised and is manifested in the inclusion of Lisa. And I think it's important, going back to what you said about why wouldn't you marry Grace Kelly? It's absolutely spot on. That it's not an accident that he's chosen one of the deemed to be the most beautiful women of all time, and most definitely in that time period and still today. That's not an accident, and I think that's something that has to be acknowledged, that men, that male gaze and the audience at the time would have just been flipping out over, especially that really nice subtle slow motion freeze frame zoom of the extreme close up when we initially see her. I just think so powerful, but also so empowered. She really had control of her own life, both financially but also sexually, which is really important. And
there's a couple of great symbols as well. You've got that cigarette box that she wants to give him.
It's too ornate. Yeah,
it's too ornate. Yeah, is a quote. And then we've got the wedding ring too, obviously. And of course, there's the overnight case, which is really a symbol of those shifting times. So not only is she sexually assertive, but look at the way that when Doyle enters, he looks at it. We have that high angle shot of him, POV shot of him looking down on it. And even, when he says, do you tell your landlord everything? It does suggest that shift of times here, when even the idea that, or the portrayal of the couple with a dog up on the roof, they sleep head to toe. This idea about marriage and what it's meant to be, and I guess we're not too far away from the 60s, which was seen as a really open time. But Lisa really is that representation of that sexual assertiveness.
Absolutely. And I think there's a couple of moments in several other of Hitchcock films, like the flushing toilet in Psycho, first time it was ever seen on film, not to mention the opening sequence when there's adultery in the sort of underwear and things like that.
Yeah, she's wearing...
So I think similar with Lisa, one of the first things that she says is asks about his love life, with that clear literal dominance of frame. She's higher in the frame. He's sort of almost helpless, almost paralysed in that sequence. It would have been quite confronting for male audiences at the time. But yeah, you're right. There's this financial, lean to being a provider with the cigarette case, and then the subtle, not so subtle hint of "marry me," and then obviously one of our favourite characters, Carl, Uber Eats Carl,
that's right,
showing up, and then she takes care of the bill. she's organised it. She's all these odd ideas, traditional ideas around courting a male, courting a female, are completely reversed. Yeah. There's a really nice little sequence that I've mentioned in my class as well. The one bit of control that he tries to have is opening the bottle of wine or champagne. Yeah. Can't do it.
No.
So Carl has to step in. There's little moments like that where he's just he's completely helpless and lends itself to that isolation confinement, which obviously ultimately leads to his need to or want to be a voyeur. So yeah, really cool. And I like the idea of the case, the cigarette case. I mean, that's what Jeffries wants. He wants that ornate lifestyle, and he wants to eat things that you wouldn't even look at when they're alive. And Lisa doesn't. She wants a little bit of shine.
Yeah. And it's funny that you say that, because he does try and overcome his emasculation by talking about his life as if he's eating rats and all that kind of stuff. And that's how he does it. And, you know, you don't have to be repulsive, Jeff. It is interesting, though, when he says to Stella initially, he goes, I want a woman that will do anything, go anywhere and do anything. And Lisa actually comes out and says, I'll do that. And he's the one that shuts her down.
Yeah, he does.
So even when she tries to be a part of his life, it's him. He's the one who's, at the end of the day, ultimately, he's the one that's not allowing her to do it. That's how he tries to maintain some sort of power and control in the relationship.
Absolutely. And there's an inflated view of his own profession as well. Like,
taking photos, mate.
Yeah, exactly. He's a photographer. I don't see a huge difference in regards to the depth or complexity of profession that he deems to have over the fashion industry. He's earning less than her, but for some reason deems his to be a lot more important. Not that financial recompense is the benchmark, but she's got her life in control. Yeah, and he's a bit all over the shop. But I really like. I mean, Stella's such an important inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now that you mentioned her, because just to go off on a tangent, if that's all right. She's I mean, I really see her as the conscience of the audience. Her delivery and her dialogue is clearly of a lower class base.
Except when she's quoting Reader's Digest.
Yeah, Reader's Digest, and and that self-evaluation of not being an educated woman, but ironically, she is the most educated because there's a simplicity to her thinking, a simplicity to her philosophy, and like you said, like. What's wrong with you? Why wouldn't you marry her?
Yeah. She's too perfect.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then that really nice connectedness with the lobster dinner and the comment that it's perfect as always. Yeah. But yeah, Stella's a really cool inclusion. But again, it all, despite the trepidation she shows and the almost the lecture she gives him about being a peeping Tom and the jail time that he's going to get, she spirals down too. So we're complicit with Jeffries in regards to our physical presence and our point of view, and philosophically we're complicit with Stella because no matter who you are, you feel uncomfortable the first time you see torso. Yeah. Especially when she sort of is warming up and bends over. It's an uncomfortable thing, no matter who you are.
To quote Jackie Charles, she's flouting society's conventions.
Exactly. And I, seeing the film so many times now, I always cast my eyes to the class. Yeah. To my class when that scene happens, and there's always several people that look away. They feel uncomfortable, and that's the idea. And we do too as the audience. And so we really align ourselves initially with Stella because she comes in and she's telling Jeff off, but she's telling us off too. Correct. And we're like, oh yeah, fair point. But then she, and so do we, spiral into that very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I do like Stella not only because she does provide this idea quite clearly about how she views traditional marriage, what it used to be and what it is now. You know, that idea about psychoanalyzing each other, which we then see in the subsequent scene with Jeff and Lisa. Yep. But I do like the fact as well that she does herself become involved. The fact that she also is quite compassionate towards those characters. Like, she looks at Miss Lonely Hearts and because she's got the knowledge being a nurse, she sees what she's about to do. Forces Jeff then to call the police. And I just love the way when she first looks out the window, I love that look that she gives as if she's staring around, looking at him, just taking it all in, and then goes directly at him and has a go at him.
And she, I mean, little bits of evidence that you guys can use in discussing that idea of being complicit as an audience, which I've said several times. It's really important that you acknowledge that, because everything that Hitchcock does, right back to what we started with, everything Hitchcock does is as a means to manipulate his audience. And Stella is a representation of the audience's conscience. I mean, she actually gets the binoculars for it and things like that. So there's things like that, and I think Lisa ends up grabbing lenses and things for him, and it becomes this sort of trio that spirals down. But yeah, you're right. I love the philosophical approach, or the old school thinking, if you like, of Stella, because that's exactly what Jeff's doing. He's overthinking, and almost like like he says, it's almost like a business or a transaction that has to be done. And and then, like you say, those scenes that ensue are direct mirror images of his thinking. I mean, while he's talking about the nagging wife,
who do we see?
Yeah, who do we see? That almost annoyance when he can't see what the helicopter pilots get to see, things like that. So it's direct mirror images throughout the entire piece. Yeah,
and that's why that Kuleshov effect is so important. And when you do go to analyse that, just be really clear about it. It's the idea that we get his reactions, and not just his either. We do get a couple of other characters, but it is his reaction, and we see when he feels a little bit guilty, or where he feels like what he's doing is unethical, or when he's curious. We get this gamut of emotions, and we get that from that 1, 2, 3 shot, especially there close up.
Yeah, and that's a really clear. It's great. It's a great sort of dissection of that film technique, because there is that reaction shot, but it doesn't give us necessarily the entire story.
Correct.
So the Kuleshov is an amazing film technique, and really and intentionally utilised. So you actively look for it. Don't be afraid to find them.
And sometimes we're sort of surprised, like when he's using the binoculars in one of the first times, we see him put them down, and we think, he's thought about it, it's unethical. But then he goes to grab the lens, and we realise we're actually quite surprised. Actually, he wants to get a better look at things.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a really nice sort of insight into his thinking with the idea of the guilt, the Kuleshov effect with the newlyweds. That he's like, all of a sudden he doesn't feel super comfortable. Because he's it's almost like he's gone too far, that it's pure. This idea, and this, like, almost that they can't wait to embrace each other, and then the landlord comes back in, and they sort of shyly separate, and then he leaves, and then they're back into it, and it's this idea of purity that he doesn't understand. It's not his philosophy on marriage. So that's a really nice one with the Kuleshov, if you want to access themes about marriage and domesticity and his views and values around that.
Yeah. And again, with some great secondary characters there, and I think the newlyweds allow for that discussion on domesticity and marriage. And even at the very end, we know that final scene when she's having a go at him, saying, I know you quit your job, I never would have married you. That idea about how that's Jeffrey's assumption of how marriage works. It's suffocating. Even we see the husband reach out the window to get some fresh air. Yeah. And we get those parallels with the Thorwalds. Is that how it sort of works? It's the nagging wife, and it sort of comes to fruition.
Yeah, not just that not just the nagging wife, but the isolation and confinement. I mean, yes, there's a bit of, I think Thorwald's wife puts a bit of mayo on it. Obviously, she's not as bad off as she may make out, but Jeffries is exactly the same. He is Mrs. Thorwald, and Lisa is Mr. Thorwald. So there's this direct reflection. I mean, if you imagine Jeffries as an empty vessel or jug, I mean, it's those, like you said, those secondary characters that fill up his personality or lack thereof in some moments.
That's a great analogy to use, actually. I encourage everyone to go out and do that, is work out which parts of which characters have reflected in him. You mentioned Anna Thorwald there. I think she's a great character just to discuss for a moment. The first thing I'll say is how I see the mirroring is when she ridicules Lars when he brings in dinner for her. She grabs the flower. He put a flower on the tray and she throws it away and laughs at him. And I just think that reflects so nicely with Jeffries, how he continually ridicules Lisa and so many things. But at the end of the day, she's murdered in this film and she dies. But we don't, at the end, we don't really feel for her, do we?
Yeah, in a gruesome fashion. But you're right. it's I think it comes back to that anonymity. Like we never access. We always get to see we only get to see what Jeff sees. So we never actually find any emotional connection with any characters.
Yeah.
So I mean, Torso is purely aesthetic, hence her name. And so I think if the film was shot differently from another director, we may be inside their apartment. We may be able to see and get to know those characters and see some development, but we don't. And I think that's a real nod to the allegorical nature of, ultimately he's proven correct, but, the allegorical idea of mistrust and the Cold War and McCarthyism and all of that stuff around, kind of ratting on your friends colloquially. Absolutely. She's a great character, but there is exactly a murder, but the thing that we feel most confronted by is when Lars looks down the lens with that break of the fourth wall, which is an amazing shot, one of the most famous in film history, and also his entry into the apartment because we are Jeff. Yeah. We don't have a connection with Anna Thord. We've got a connection with solving a case to be proven correct. Yeah. And then we're confronted because, oh crap, we've been busted. Yeah.
And it's that great line when he says, "What do you want from me?" And there's silence. Yeah. It sort of suggests Jeffries doesn't know. Yeah, we don't know either. Exactly. We just want to know. We're curious, and that comes down to, in essence, human nature. Yeah. And even the dog, which is quite curious as well, and quite an innocent sort of not character. It's an animal, but it's a curious sort of animal, and that how it dies, and it's significant.
And that's the only time there's some real emotion in the film is the death of the dog, which really highlights the disparity between that emotional outburst and the lack of empathy and connection from the neighbours around them. They don't, not that they don't care, but they don't come out of their come out of their individual bubbles to try and sort of console or to help and then
it's only Miss Lonely Hearts.
Only Lonely Hearts that has that empathy, and that's the idea of her emotional mindset. But yeah, I mean that's more sad than
correct.
Anna Thor's death, which is
and again it comes into perspective, and we are cemented in Jeffrey's apartment. Really, we rarely get to leave it, and that's again comes down to Hitchcock and the way that he makes this film. So, following the murder and one of my favourite parts of the film is when he gets arrested and it takes him 16 seconds to tell them all about what he's done, where the body is, why he killed the dog.
Get to the credits.
The closing sequence I really like, because it tells us so much and in so little time, and it's that nice circular coming back to the establishing sequence. So I want to talk about Miss Lonely Hearts and the ending for her.
Yeah.
Is this her relationship now with the songwriter? Is this a good thing for her and for women, or is it not? Is she part of this cycle where she needs to find someone?
I think it's a good question. I think the fact that she had given up and was willing to go to the lengths that she was going to go to, I think allows us to believe that it's real happiness at the end, that she had given up all hope, and there's real happy emotion. Like that's all legitimate and authentic. I think the songwriter's a great character because struggling to finish his composition, and then a comment from Lisa that it's like he's playing especially for us, and it's a broken composition, obviously symbolic of the broken relationship they have. And then
by the end
there's a completion, both with the song, with Lisa and Jeffrey, and also for the songwriter and Lonely Hearts. And I think that diegetic motif throughout is really powerful. So look, I view it as authentic in the end, absolutely.
And there is that nice reflection because Lisa does see herself as Miss Lonely Hearts. Jeff doesn't. Jeff sees her as Miss Torso, and that goes down to that idea of the male gaze. But it is nice how they both are moved by this music. I mean, you had that long shot of them together, both looking out the window. And then at the end, obviously, both in what seems to be quite happy and committed relationships, which is great.
Yeah, I mean that last shot's pretty amazing, and that's what creates a lot of debate. Going back to what I was saying about
it does.
Acknowledging how you view the film, both from a gender point of view or a social and cultural point of view. That I've heard a lot of people say that she gave up. Yeah, that Lisa gave up.
But she's hiding,
She's hiding. She became subservient. I mean, I don't see it that way.
No, I don't either.
I think she's the compromise that she's made is intentional. It's calculated. Yeah. Hence, removing the Himalayas book into the fashion magazine. And we've sort of spoken about it with the literally wearing the pants. Yeah. I just think there's a real comfort with, like you said, with those two, really comfortable, really happy. But I still really see her as being the powerful. Yeah, and there's that look she gives as well. Like, as I said, people say that, oh no, this is what she has to do as a woman in this society. She has to hide part of her from her husband. But no, it's not that at all. It's look at the looks that she gives. It's almost devious. Like she's there going, oh, I'm going to pull the wool over your eyes here. Yeah, which is great, and that's why she's such a powerful character from the start to the end. Yeah. And he's proud of her. He says that. He says how proud of her, and he looks up at her in that final or the penultimate scene when he's broken both his legs, and he looks up at her and goes, "I'm so proud of you." And that's that look that he gives her is one of just complete admiration. Yeah, and I think a lot of people have said that she has to scale that wall to prove something to him. I don't necessarily see it that way. I think she ultimately does prove herself to him, but she doesn't give it a second thought. No. She's straight out. She takes control of that situation, and as a result, he has a lot of respect for her, and he deems that to be, I guess, the sort of tipping point for him into respect and admiration, like you say. But I don't believe she has to sort of psych herself up to do that. No. That's just innate. It is. And she even says that. It's like, oh, let's go. Let's go dig it up. Off she goes. Exactly. And I think that, coupled with the looks at the end, I think that for me really highlights the control. And manipulation's a bit of a negative word, but I think she knows what she's doing. Yeah, she does. Yeah. And I do like the fact what got her involved in this case was the handbag. It's a fashion thing. It's a career that got her into it. That idea of female intuition. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, if you go back, you'll see so many of the male characters, they do underestimate women in this film, and ultimately it's the women who proves to be strong. And female strength is seen not just in Lisa and Stella, but you see it with Miss Lonely Hearts and Miss Torso have to fend men away from them. Yeah, that's a really confronting scene. Obviously, with Lonely Hearts, the position she's willing to put herself in order to be valued in society. Obviously, takes control in the end of the situation, but could have obviously been. And the fact the blinds are kind of half shut, those Venetian blinds, only adds to the angst and the sadness we really do feel for her by the end. And then obviously she breaks down and cries. And again, we're looking down on her the whole film. Yeah, there's that status, implied status from Hitchcock for us and for Jeffries that. Yeah, we're always using that high angle shot. That we're always looking down, literally and figuratively in a sense of status. And I think the idea of the blinds being drawn is that she doesn't let us look in as much as the others. She deems herself to be half a character because she's not socially complete. Hence she's a spinster. She is, exactly, which is a really negative connotation. It's like absolutely you're not good enough to get married. Yeah, which I think is not only the length she goes through with the sort of the gentleman caller, but also that amazing shot when we see her at the end of the alleyway with the kind of colour palette being quite a little bit darker, and she's most people have got the sleeves rolled up and it's pretty relaxed kind of after work drinks, and she's decked to the nines, as they say, decked out, and she has to go into this little what looks to be fairly relaxed and social environment, and dominated by men as well. To try and win a man and win her place in society, which is obviously such a clear disparity with Lisa and her control and influence.
That's it. So we've sort of come to the end.
Yeah, cool. Awesome.
Now, Jim Lord, is there anything else you'd like to add about Rear Window?
Look, I think not necessarily about the film in general specifically. I think more to do with, like, this is just two gym blokes having a chat, and what's important is that, cool, hopefully you've got a couple of little bits here and there, but we sit down and watch the film the same as you guys will, and I think it's really important that you value your individual interpretation. The student in my class, Vittorio, actually, shout out to Vittorio, he noticed something that I hadn't really noticed before. I mean, with the positioning of the candles, with that parallel action of, because we always talk about the raising of the glass with Jeffries and Lonely Hearts, the parallel, the two lives or the two contexts, but there's a lot of things set up the same way, the candles, and that's little symbols like that are great, and you've just got to find those little motifs. Sometimes they'll reach a dead end, or sometimes you'll open a door into amazing complexities and all these new ideas that can highlight that connectedness throughout the film. So I guess closing point, just back your individual interpretation. That's what it's about. If you can prove it, you can write it. So and good luck to everyone.
That's what we love about English is, and it's a pain as well. But there's no one right way to do things.
Correct.
There's not even one right way to write an essay. There are thousands of ways that you can do it. And we find that when we get those unique interpretations, when we get those really cool pieces of evidence that we don't normally see, that sort of our eyebrows go up and we go, that's interesting. We really like that. So while those important scenes are crucial, and you should be using them from time to time, do try and find that little nugget if you can, because it can go a long way.
Absolutely, and get it into your drafts. I think that's really important, because there'll be sometimes your teacher will say, "Well, I like your idea, but it's too much of a left field inclusion, so you might have to go back and find another symbol or motif or some sort of allegorical or thematic connection. So don't save all your great ideas for your SAC. Try and get them out so you can have that discussion with your teachers."
Great. Jim Lord, it's been a pleasure. We hope to get you back on the podcast.
Oh, I'd love to. That's grouse.
Later on this year, be great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No worries at all. We'll see you next time on the Six Ps podcast.